What happens when help is a day away, a week away, or 1,000 miles away? When the map ends and there is nothing between a person and whatever the wild or other people might do to them. In 3 very different places, 3 very different outcomes show how isolation multiplies danger and uncertainty. 2 hikers found shot on a misty trail in the Pacific Northwest. An Alaskan trapper discovered only in scattered remains months after he failed to return. And a Soviet doctor at an Antarctic station who, with no surgeon to call, operated on himself to survive. Each story answers a question and raises another. Each shows a different face of what it means to be utterly alone. First, Pinnacle Lake, Mount Pilchuck, July 11, 2006. Second, Prince of Wales Island, 1939, the case of trapper Chris Colby. Third, the Antarctic Station, 1961, when Leonid Rogozov performed his own appendectomy. We will walk these cases in order, set the scene, lay out what was found, and then examine what the evidence allows us to say with confidence, and where only hypotheses remain. If you like deep mysteries, subscribe for more, and check the description for sources. The trail into Mount Pilchuck climbs through old growth and low clouds. In summer, the Pacific Northwest can feel like 2 worlds at once, green and lived in, but also threaded with distances that erase radio and reach of help. On July 11, 2006, a family set out to camp near Pinnacle Lake, not far from a popular trailhead. The day was ordinary until it felt extraordinary to them. The wife in the family wrote later. She described an overriding sense of unease, an intuition that something was wrong. They turned back. The next day, 2 hikers were found roughly 2 miles up the same trail. They were a mother, Mary, 56, and her daughter, Susanna, 27. Both had suffered a single gunshot wound to the head. The scene, as investigators described it, offered limited physical evidence. 2 shell casings were located near the bodies, and a partial DNA sample was recovered from the site. Detectives canvassed the area, interviewed the family who had turned back, and followed up on leads. Mary and Susanna's husband, who had reported them missing, cooperated with the investigation, and law enforcement treated the scene as a double homicide. What stands out immediately is how thin the trail of evidence is. 2 casings, a partial DNA profile, footprints in a damp forest that can be smudged by rain and booted by other hikers. No confirmed eyewitnesses besides the family who had turned back, who were, by their own account, nearly within earshot of the place where the bodies were later found. It's possible they might have been close enough to hear something. It's possible they heard nothing at all. Investigators followed standard protocols: evidence collection, forensics, public appeals. The partial DNA sample yielded no match in the databases at that time. No suspect was identified. The case remains unsolved. What theories persist? One possibility is ambush. Someone on the trail or in the vicinity lies in wait and shoots. Another is that the victims encountered a follower or a transient person whose actions escalated into violence. It's also important to note what the evidence does not support definitively. There is no documented confession, no forensics tying a named individual to the scene, no credible witness who places a suspect with the victims. The 2 shell casings tell us the weapon was fired, but they do not tell us by themselves who fired it or why. The partial DNA is a clue, potentially crucial, but without a match, it is a lead that goes cold. The family's intuition and retreat add a human, nearly gothic detail, the sense of something wrong, like a weather change in the air. It's tempting to read that as near-miss awareness, the kind of hair-raising moment that later makes us ask, what if? But intuition alone is not evidence. One hypothesis is that the family might have passed close enough to hear the attack or to have seen a fleeing figure. Another hypothesis is that their memory of the feeling is that, a feeling, not a factual account of events. We cannot confirm either from the physical record. What matters in this case is the role of remoteness. Trails that seem popular still run through large tracts of wilderness where minutes separate you from anyone who might intervene. In places like Mount Pilchuck, phone signals are unreliable. A shout can carry for a short distance, but does nothing if the perpetrator is already gone. For investigators, isolation complicates everything. The preservation of a crime scene is more vulnerable to weather and wildlife. Witnesses are fewer and often transient. Physical traces can be obscured by rain or other hikers. That explains in part why the Pinnacle Lake double homicide remains a locked puzzle. The pieces are small and exposed to the elements. From a mist-laced trail in the Cascades, the narrative shifts north to islands carved by tides and spruce. Prince of Wales Island, Alaska, 1939. Chris Colby was a trapper, a man shaped by seasons of solitude and the economy of furs, someone whose life depended on routine and attention to the land. When Colby failed to return as expected, concern rippled through his community. 2 official searches went out during the summer months. The Hansen cabin was located in reasonably good repair, doors intact, stove standing, a place that suggested no immediate forceful upheaval. Yet there were odd, troubling details. A fresh hole in the cabin wall, apparently from a bullet. The pelts, and thus the trapper's livelihood, were gone. Months later, in October, a search party returned and found scattered scavenged remains and personal items across a wide area. Among the objects recovered was Colby's .357 handgun. Investigators noted the firearm's condition. The mainspring was broken. For those unfamiliar, the mainspring is the small but crucial spring in a revolver that strips cartridges from the cylinder or helps in the firing mechanism. Its failure can render the gun inoperable at a critical moment. Clothing recovered bore tooth marks consistent with wolf scavenging. These facts, the scattered remains, the broken .357, the bite marks, create a grim tableau. One interpretation is straightforward. Colby was attacked and killed by wolves, and by the time the October searchers found the site, scavenging had dispersed remains and clothing. The broken mainspring supports a version of the story in which Colby was unarmed when wolves attacked, or the gun failed to fire when it was needed. Another interpretation is possible. Colby may have met violence at the hands of another person, or in an accidental conflict, and then been scavenged by wolves after death. The bullet hole in the cabin wall raises questions. Was there a prior struggle near the cabin? Did someone fire shots to deter animals or warn a distance? The cabin's otherwise intact state tends to argue against a violent struggle inside. Yet outside the cabin, the scene was chaotic. We must be explicit. Neither scenario can be confirmed absolutely from the recovered artifacts. The broken mainspring is physical evidence that the gun would have been unreliable. The wolf bite marks on clothing are physical evidence of scavenging. But neither proves the sequence of events conclusively. Did the gun fail in the moment of attack, or was it smashed afterward? Did wolves begin scavenging after Colby's death by other causes, or did wolves cause the death? The evidence supports a horrific end in the wilderness, but it leaves room for competing hypotheses. That ambiguity is the hallmark of remote cases. Nature often erases the final clarifying detail. The emotional weight of this story is its particular kind of loneliness. Trappers are inherently vulnerable. Their work takes them far from neighbours, their schedules tied to seasons, their dwellings rudimentary. When something goes wrong, there is no emergency service to call. An isolated cabin can be a place of refuge, or a place where small misfortunes metastasize into catastrophe. Wolves, human adversaries, accidents, each becomes more lethal in the absence of quick help. The Colby case is an archetype of trapping-era risk and the blunt logic of ecosystems. In the wild, death often invites more death in the form of scavenging. That secondary violence makes the primary cause harder to read. From the harshness of the Alaskan woods, the narrative swings to a different kind of isolation entirely. Not a remote cabin in a forest, but an entire continent cut off by ice and weather. The Antarctic station in 1961. Leonid Rogozov was a Soviet physician stationed at a polar research base when he developed acute appendicitis. There was no practical way to evacuate him. A blizzard had closed the skies and seas. Any attempt to move him would have been fatal. The base had 2 assistants, a driver and a meteorologist. neither of whom were surgeons. They could help in holding lights, in passing instruments, in steadying hands, but not in performing the delicate work that appendectomies typically require. Rogozov's condition worsened rapidly. Appendicitis is a common surgical emergency. The appendix becomes inflamed, can perforate, and cause infection across the abdomen. In any well-staffed hospital, a surgeon removes the appendix under general anesthesia. But on a polar station under blizzard conditions, none of those options were available. Faced with limited choices, wait and risk ruptured peritonitis, or operate himself, Rogozov made the decision to perform his own appendectomy. The technical details are striking, but should be presented plainly. He used local anesthetic, Novocaine, to numb the area. Novocaine is a local anesthetic that numbs surface tissue and deeper layers where injected. It is not a substitute for full general anesthesia, which renders a patient unconscious. Rogozov made an incision in his lower abdomen, exposing the layers of muscle and peritoneum. Using a mirror, he initially guided his instruments visually. A mirror here served as a limited substitute for direct surgical visualization. It allows the operator to see angles and structures that would otherwise be impossible when operating on oneself. At a crucial moment, while suturing, he accidentally cut a section of his intestine. That near disaster demanded an immediate repair. He had to recognize the injury, sew it closed, and continue, all while awake, in pain, and with two non-surgeons assisting. This sequence, surgical exposure, local anesthesia, mirror-guided incision, accidental intestinal cut and immediate repair, reads like improvisation at the edge of what a human can do. Rogozov later recovered after receiving antibiotics and rest at the station. He survived the ordeal and was later honored for his action upon return. His case became a documented example of extreme self-reliance. When evacuation is impossible and the alternative is almost certain death, extraordinary measures may become necessary. The Rogozov story is the counterpoint that keeps the other two cases from collapsing into pure fatalism. Isolation does not always end in death. Sometimes it reveals resilience, improvisation, skill. But even here, isolation compounds risk. Operating on oneself increases the chances of complications, bleeding, infection, incomplete repair, and yet it was also the action that made survival possible. There was no quick rescue, no specialist to call, no helicopter within an hour. The environment imposed a brutal calculus: act with the tools on hand, or accept the odds of a fatal outcome. Connecting these three narratives reveals a pattern. Remoteness multiplies the stakes of every decision and hides critical clarifications. In the Pinnacle Lake case, isolation turned a crime into a riddle by degrading the evidence trail. In the Colby case, remoteness allowed scavengers and time to erase details that might have told us whether a human or animal was the initial killer. In Rogozov's case, isolation forced decisive, technically demanding action by the person most qualified to act. And that action made the difference between life and death. Forensic limitations are a recurring theme. In accessible locales, investigators can secure a scene, bring in specialists, and quickly preserve perishable evidence. In remote locations, weather, wildlife, and the passage of time can change a scene before anyone trained arrives. Partial DNA samples can be a breakthrough, or a dead end, if there is no database match. A broken mainspring on a firearm can suggest weapon failure, but without a clear timeline, it cannot by itself prove the sequence of events. In each case, the material reality, the casings, the broken gun, the bite-marked clothing, the mirror and anesthetic, can ground narratives, but they do not always provide the narrative's final sentence. Then, there are psychological effects. Isolation is not only about physical distance, but about the thinning of context. In remote settings, people are more likely to accept risk, to tolerate discomfort, to forego immediate help because of the impracticality of access. Long-term solitude brings boredom, homesickness, depletion of social checks that keep small conflicts from escalating. When incidents occur, there are fewer witnesses and fewer corroborating voices. Memory becomes the only record for many actions. That's important when we consider the family on the Mount Pilchuck Trail. Their recollection of a bad feeling is real and human. It might be treated as a near-miss observation, but memory is also reconstructive. It fits the later knowledge of the tragedy into an earlier, ambiguous moment. That's not to dismiss their account. It is a piece of the human evidence, but it is to show how human perception can complicate an investigation. Consider the role of animals and weather as agents that alter evidence. In Alaska, wolves are scavengers adapted to take apart what death leaves behind. Their feeding can scatter clothing and bones over a wide radius, making it hard to find a coherent scene. Rain on a mountain trail can wash away blood or boot prints, while fallen leaves can hide a footprint. These natural actors do not bear moral agency in the way a human perpetrator does, but they shape the post-event landscape in ways that mimic, mask, or erase human causes. For investigators, this is both technical and deeply frustrating. It's also worth noting the social margins in which these stories unfold. Trappers, hikers, polar researchers, all are people who accept forms of risk to pursue work, passion, or science. They are not reckless in most cases. They are pragmatic, often well informed about danger, and prepared within the limits of their environment. Yet the thinness of rescue infrastructure in remote places means that the margin for error is small. One mechanical failure, one misjudged weather window, one chance encounter with violence can become fatal because the safety net is stretched thin. How should we think about causation in such instances? The responsible approach is to name what evidence supports and to label where speculation begins. In Mount Pilchuck, physical evidence shows 2 shootings, 2 spent casings, a partial DNA sample, and 2 victims. From that, we can say there was a homicide, and we can report the investigative steps. One theory is that the attackers waited in ambush. Another is that the victims crossed paths with a transient aggressor. We cannot confirm either as fact. In Colby's case, the broken mainspring and wolf bite marks support scenarios of either animal attack on an unarmed man or post-mortem scavenging after human violence. Both are plausible, but neither is conclusive. In Rogozov's case, the documentation of steps taken, local anesthetic used, mirror employed, and inadvertent intestinal cut repaired is detailed enough to describe what occurred and to justify the conclusion that his self-operation saved his life. All 3 tales also reveal different responses to isolation. The victims in the first 2 had no practical means to change their fates once the fatal moment arrived. In Rogozov's instance, isolation made survival possible by forcing his hand into action. His medical competence and decisive choice became the instrument of survival. The same structural factor, remoteness, produced opposite outcomes. When we look at the emotional residue of these stories, there is a common, somber chord. Families and friends left behind questions. Investigators worked with the materials they could collect. Communities who live in remote regions carry a tacit knowledge that the world beyond maps has different rules. And for viewers or readers who encounter these narratives long after the facts are recorded, a particular kind of unease emerges. The knowledge that ordinary life can end in a single moment, without much advice or explanation, and that the world will often keep its secrets. Confronted with unresolved cases, we also confront our own appetite for closure. It is human to want a tidy story that assigns motive and meaning. But in remote tragedies, the evidence often refuses to be tidy. Mountains, islands, and polar wastes are not purposefully obscure. They simply make preservation and investigation difficult. That reality should shape how we treat these stories. Speculation is part of human curiosity, but it must be bracketed and named. One possibility is ambush. It is possible that wolves were responsible. It is possible that a man performed emergency surgery on himself and survived. These are plausible narratives. They are not necessarily complete or final. Before we close, there is a final practical observation about technology and its limits. Modern forensic science, DNA databases, improved ballistic analysis, and rapid communication have reduced the number of cold leads in many jurisdictions. Yet these technologies have limits. Remote scenes are still vulnerable to degradation. Partial DNA can now be more useful if databases expand, but many cases remain outside that reach. A broken mainspring stays a broken mainspring. It tells us something mechanical but not always the human sequence. And a diary entry or an after-the-fact account is valuable context, not a forensic substitute. In the end, these stories are not simply tales of horror or triumph. They are lessons in how environment shapes fate. Isolation strips away options. It amplifies the consequences of mechanical failure, human conflict, and medical emergency. It can conceal violence and erase evidence. It can force courage to operate beyond ordinary limits. The thinness of rescue and the reach of weather and animals mean that some questions will remain open. That uncertainty is part of what keeps us asking and what makes these cases linger in the mind. If any single through line ties these events together, it is this: the landscape is an actor. Remoteness does not explain motive or intention, but it does determine how events unfold and how the aftermath can be understood. In Mount Pilchuck, the forest and the trail made a crime scene fragile and an investigation difficult. On Prince of Wales Island, the wild acted as both potential killer and curtain raiser, scattering evidence and creating ambiguity. In Antarctica, the environment removed rescue as an option, forcing the only available expert to become both surgeon and patient. We leave these stories with more questions than answers, and that is appropriate. Some mysteries remain locked because that is the nature of the places where they occurred. Our role as observers is to report the facts with care, to separate hypothesis from proof, and to hold the memory of the people involved with respect. Viewer discretion is advised. These accounts involve violent death and extreme hardship, described with restraint but truthfully. If you want to go deeper into any of these cases, sources are in the description. Support the channel on Patreon, or submit your story via the form in the description. If you have a first-hand account from a remote place, an experience of survival, a mystery, or a record that might shed light on cold cases, consider sharing it. Remote cases often crack when new observers come forward. We return, briefly, to the opening question. What happens when help is a day, a week, or 1,000 miles away? The answer is not singular. Sometimes remoteness magnifies cruelty. Sometimes it erases clarity. Sometimes it makes space for an act of extraordinary courage. In all cases, it forces us to reckon with limits of our reach, of our knowledge, and of the thin safety nets that civilization assumes are always there. When those nets do not exist, choices are starker and outcomes are more final. The stories we have traced today show the range of those outcomes, what can be known, what must remain conjecture, and what we owe one another in memory and in continued investigation.